All right, let's dive into early Islamic history in Medina. You know, those pivotal early battles during the Prophet Muhammad's life that shaped the course of Islam.
Hmm.
We're going to try to understand this period through excerpts from The Life of Muhammad, al-Waqidi's Kitab al-Maghazi,
Right.
translated by Rizvi Pfizer. It's like getting a glimpse into how early Muslims saw these events.
Yeah, al-Waqidi himself was a scholar in Medina back in the 2nd century Hijra, so that's the 8th century for us.
Okay.
His book is this really interesting mix of biography and verses from the Quran. It gives us a unique understanding of the Prophet's life and teachings from that time.
And of course, to help us break down all this fascinating material, we've got our expert
Of course.
who specializes in early Islamic history.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear your take as we unpack these stories.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. What's fascinating about al-Waqidi's work is that experts are still debating, like, what kind of book this even is and where he got his information.
Sure.
Even with those questions, it's really valuable, It gives us these vivid details and anecdotes that really bring those early days of Islam to life.
Speaking of vivid details, I've got to ask you about this story from the book about the Battle of Badr.
Okay.
A Muslim's camel is totally exhausted on the way to Badr.
Mm-hmm.
Can't go any further.
Right.
His brother is freaking out, like even vowing to God that if they make it back to Medina, he'll sacrifice the poor camel.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that paints a picture of how desperate the situation was, right? The Battle of Badr was this first major conflict between the Muslims who were newly settled in Medina and the Quraysh, the powerful Quraysh tribe from Mecca.
Yeah.
The stakes were incredibly high. This was about survival, not just territory.
Right. And then classic al-Waqidi style, things get miraculous.
Exactly. The Prophet Muhammad, he comes across these brothers and their camel.
Yeah.
He asks for some water, gargles with it while performing ablution, and then tells them to open the camel's mouth, pours the water in a bit on the head, neck, hump, and boom, the camel is up and ready to go.
Al-Waqidi presents this as a miracle.
Yeah.
You can see how this story would have really solidified their faith, the faith that Muslims had in God's support
Totally.
and in the Prophet's power.
Can you imagine, witnessing something like that?
Oh, yeah.
It would be unbelievable. And this story, with that emphasis on divine intervention, it kind of sets the stage for the Battle of Badr. Can you tell us a bit more about the context of the battle itself?
Sure. To understand Badr, you got to understand the tensions between the Muslims in Medina
Right.
and the Quraysh back in Mecca.
Okay.
Now, the Quraysh, they were the dominant tribe in Mecca at the time. They controlled the Kaaba, the holiest site in Islam.
Right.
So they saw Muhammad's teachings as this threat to their religious and economic power.
So it really was a clash of ideologies, right?
Absolutely. And al-Waqidi doesn't just give us, the facts of the battle.
Yeah.
He introduces us to some of the key figures
Okay.
on both sides.
Okay.
So we meet Abu Jahl.
This staunch opponent of Muhammad, known for his stubbornness and resistance to change. And then there's Utbah bi Rabi'a,
Okay.
who, unlike Abu Jahl, he's portrayed as more open to reason. He actually tries to persuade his fellow Quraysh to avoid bloodshed,
Really?
arguing that, hey, Muhammad should not be underestimated.
Wow. So interesting to see how al-Waqidi brings these guys to life, giving us a sense of their personalities, their motivations. It reminds me how history is just full of these intricate clashes of belief, clashes of personality.
Right, and it's not always clear-cut, right?
Right.
Al-Waqidi points out the story of Qubay bi Yasef,
Okay.
a Muslim who was captured during a raid. Later on, he ends up marrying the daughter of the very man he killed in battle.
Wow.
It's like even amidst this conflict, there were these complex personal relationships.
That's a great example of how personal stories can challenge, like those black and white narratives we have about history.
Exactly. And, al-Waqid's book also gets into how the early Muslim community, addressed these ethical dilemmas that came up from these battles.
Right.
Things like the division of spoils of war, the treatment of prisoners. It wasn't just about the fighting, right?
Right. Yeah.
There were these really crucial decisions being made, decisions that shaped their society.
Speaking of impactful battles, I want to hear more about the Battle of Uhud.
Okay.
From what I've read, this was a significant defeat for the Muslims.
Yeah. Uhud is a pivotal moment in early Islamic history, and al-Waqid's account captures both the intensity and, the emotional toll of the battle.
Okay.
It starts with the Muslims pushing back the Quraysh forces, and we see these early successes. They fuel their confidence.
Right.
But then there's this pivotal moment where those positioned as archers
Okay.
on a nearby hill, they leave their post thinking the battle's won.
Seems like a critical error.
It was. The Quraysh cavalry, seeing this opening, regroup and they launch a counterattack.
Hmm.
The Muslims are caught completely off guard, and what seems like victory turns into this devastating defeat.
You can only imagine how devastating this loss at Uhud must have been for those early Muslims.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, it also forced them to reevaluate their strategies
Yeah.
and ultimately become stronger.
One of the most dramatic moments of the battle is the story of Ubay bi Khalaf.
Mm-hmm.
Abu Jahl's son, who was so determined to avenge his father's death at Badr.
Right.
He charges at the Prophet Muhammad, but in this twist, the Prophet throws a spear that strikes Ubay down.
Right. And this is where al-Waqidi highlights that belief in divine intervention, right?
Exactly. He says the spear was guided by God's hand, striking Ubay precisely between his helmet and armor. It reinforces that idea that the Muslims, they were fighting a divinely ordained battle.
It's amazing how al-Waqidi just weaves together the human drama of this battle with this sense of the supernatural. How does he deal with the heavy losses suffered by the Muslims at Uhud?
He doesn't shy away from, the brutality of the fighting.
Right.
And the deep sorrow felt in the aftermath. We see those individual acts of bravery, sacrifice, but also the grief of those who lost loved ones. There's this particularly poignant moment when we see Hind bat Utbah, a prominent woman from the Quraysh, mourning her son,
Wow.
and the Prophet Muhammad's own sadness
Yeah.
at the losses among his companions.
It really humanizes them, doesn't it? Reminds us that these weren't just names in a history book, but real people
Yeah.
who experienced real loss, real pain.
It leads us to another defining event,
Right.
the Siege of Medina. This is where the very survival of the Muslim community was at stake.
Okay, before we jump into that story, could you explain what Hijra means? I know it relates to the migration of the Muslims from Mecca to Medina.
Sure, the Hijra was a turning point in early Islamic history. It marked that emigration of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina back in 622 AD. They faced persecution in Mecca. And this journey, it signified that establishment of the first Muslim community in Medina.
So the Hijra is that journey
Yeah.
from Mecca to Medina.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Now back to the siege. Sounds like this was a real test of faith and ingenuity for the Muslims. What happened?
Well, a coalition of tribes, united in their opposition to Muhammad and the growing Muslim community, they completely surrounded Medina. Determined to crush the Muslims once and for all. It seemed like an impossible situation. The Muslims, they were vastly outnumbered.
I can only imagine that feeling of being trapped.
Right.
So how did they survive?
This is where we see the strategic brilliance of the Muslims, right?
Okay.
Inspired by a Persian convert named Salman al-Farsi, they dig this massive trench around Medina.
Yeah.
It was this groundbreaking defensive strategy
Wow.
that totally neutralized the enemy's cavalry, who were like a major part of the attacking force.
That's incredible. What a stroke of genius. Must have been backbreaking work, though.
Al-Waqidi describes not just that physical labor of digging the trench,
Right.
but the mental strain,
Right.
of the siege. The Muslims, they were constantly under threat. Very little food, grueling test of their endurance.
But it seems like they weren't just, strong. They were also incredibly clever. I remember reading about this Muslim named Nu'aym b. Masood,
Oh, yeah.
who used, his wit to outsmart the enemy.
Knew him. He was a master of espionage.
Wow.
He cleverly used, his relationships to kind of sow discord among those various tribes that made up the besieging force.
Right.
By, subtly playing on their existing rivalries, their mistrust.
Yeah.
He managed to, weaken their alliance.
Wow.
His actions were a major factor in the enemy's retreat.
It's like a scene out of the spy thriller.
Yeah.
What would it have been like to witness such cunning in action?
It shows that the early Muslims weren't just warriors. They were thinkers, strategists, diplomats. But there's another layer to this siege,
Okay.
a more complex, sensitive one involving the Banu Qurayza tribe.
Before we get into that, I want to understand who these tribes were in relation to the Muslims. You mentioned earlier the Ansar and the Muhajirun.
Right.
Could you explain that a little?
Sure. The Ansar were the people of Medina who welcomed and supported the Prophet Muhammad and his followers, the Muhajirun, when they arrived from Mecca.
Okay.
The Muhajirun were those immigrants, those who had left their homes in Mecca to join the Prophet in Medina. So these two groups, they formed the core of that early Muslim community in Medina.
So the Ansar are like the local allies,
Exactly.
and the Muhajirun are the newcomer.
The newcomers.
Okay, that makes sense. So where do the Banu Qurayza fit into all this?
The Banu Qurayza were a Jewish tribe who had been living in Medina before the arrival of the Muslims.
Right.
Initially, they had formed a treaty with the Muslims, agreeing to, coexist peacefully. But during the siege, things took this tragic turn when the Banu Qurayza, they broke the treaty,
Oh, wow.
siding with the enemy.
An act of betrayal. How did the Muslims respond?
Their response was harsh. After the siege ended, the men of the Banu Qurayza were executed,
Wow.
and their women and children were taken as captives. It's a dark chapter in early Islamic history, and al-Waqidi's account reflects that, that gravity of the situation.
It's a stark reminder that even in victory, there are these very difficult choices, actions that are hard to fully understand from our modern perspective.
You're right.
Yeah.
It raises questions about, the complexities of war, leadership, and the ethical dilemmas faced by those in power. It's a story that continues to be debated and analyzed by, historians and theologians alike.
After such a grueling experience, I imagine the Muslims must have felt relieved when the siege was finally over. Did this mark like a period of peace for them?
Well, not exactly. While the siege of Medina ended in this, decisive victory for the Muslims, it wasn't the end of their struggles. But it did lead to another pivotal event. One that might seem like a setback at first, but actually laid the groundwork for even greater things. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Yeah.
This is where we really start to see the Prophet's strategic mind come into play, isn't it?
It is. Now think about this. After years of conflict, the Prophet Muhammad and his followers, they set out from Medina to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, this journey of immense religious significance. However, as they approach Mecca, they're met with resistance from the Quraysh.
So even the pilgrimage becomes a point of contention.
Exactly. The Quraysh, still wary of the growing Muslim presence, refuse to allow them entry into Mecca.
Wow.
Tensions are high, and it looks like another battle is inevitable.
So what happened?
Instead of resorting to violence, the Prophet Muhammad chooses negotiation. And after days of these, tense discussions, they agree on a treaty. This treaty, known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah,
Right.
might have initially seemed like a concession on the part of the Muslims.
In what way?
Well, some of the terms seem to favor the Quraysh. For example, the Muslims, they were prevented from performing the pilgrimage that year,
Oh, wow.
and they had to return to Medina.
Really?
But what al-Waqi helps us see is that this treaty was actually a strategic masterpiece. It gave the Muslims something they desperately needed: time.
Time for what?
Time to consolidate their power, time to build alliances, and most importantly, time to be seen as a legitimate political force in the region.
So the Prophet was playing the long game,
He was.
knowing that this temporary setback would lead to greater gains.
Exactly. And al-Waqidi, through his storytelling, helps us see this, He tells the story of Al-Jad Bikays, a Muslim who, upon hearing the terms of the treaty, became incredibly worried. He expresses his doubts, fearing that the Muslims will, die of thirst without being able to enter Mecca.
Wow.
But then, miraculously, the Prophet Muhammad, through prayer, replenishes their scarce water supply. It's a story that highlights that faith and the resilience of the Muslims, even in the face of adversity.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And that's where we'll leave it for now. We've covered so much in this first part of our deep dive, from the miraculous camel at Badr to the strategic brilliance at the siege of Medina and the long-game thinking of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. But we've only just begun to explore this fascinating world of early Islam in Medina.
Welcome back to our deep dive into early Islamic history in Medina. Last time, we left off with that Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which, might have seemed like a setback then, but it turned out to be a really smart move by the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah, it's amazing how something that looks like a disadvantage can actually become a stepping stone to something much bigger.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear what happened next. Does that treaty actually hold?
It did, and it's during this time of relative peace that the Muslim community, they really start to flourish.
Okay.
Freed from that constant threat of war, they could focus on strengthening their internal structures, solidifying alliances, and spreading that message of Islam. It was a time of growth and consolidation.
So what did this growth look like? How did that Muslim community in Medina evolve during this time?
They think of it as a time of of intense community building, right?
Okay.
The Muslims in Medina, both the Muhajirun, those who had emigrated from Mecca,
Right.
and the Ansar, the people of Medina who had welcomed them,
Mm.
they worked together to establish this new social order based on Islamic principles.
Must have been an incredible challenge.
It was. Imagine building a society from the ground up, figuring out how to govern, how to resolve disputes, how to care for the needy, all while staying true to those teachings of Islam. It was a monumental task, but one that the early Muslims embraced with, remarkable determination and commitment.
Do you have any specific examples of how they established this new order? Like what kind of precedents do they set?
Oh, absolutely. One of the key things they focused on was establishing this system of justice and fairness. Al-Waqidi shares these stories of the Prophet Muhammad acting as a judge, carefully listening to disputes and issuing rulings based on his understanding of Islamic principles. His judgments, they emphasized fairness, compassion, and a deep concern for the well-being of the community as a whole.
So he wasn't just a religious leader, but also a political and social leader, like shaping the very fabric of their society.
Exactly. And his actions served as these powerful precedents for how disputes should be resolved and justice should be administered within that growing Muslim community.
Mhm.
These early rulings laid the groundwork for the development of Islamic law, known as Sharia, which continues to be a central aspect of Islamic practice today.
It's fascinating to see how those early precedents in Medina had such a lasting impact on Islamic thought and practice.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that this period wasn't just about, internal development.
Okay.
It was also about outreach, expanding the reach of Islam.
Okay.
With the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in place, the Muslims were able to, to send out emissaries to different tribes, different rulers across Arabia, inviting them to embrace Islam.
So this is during this time of relative peace that the seeds for the rapid spread of Islam were really sown.
That's right. The Prophet Muhammad's message of monotheism, social justice, and spiritual renewal, it resonated with many people across the Arabian Peninsula. And as more and more tribes embraced Islam, that balance of power began to shift.
So it sounds like that Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which might have seemed like a concession, actually played right into the Prophet's hands.
It did, by choosing, diplomacy over immediate conquest. He set in motion this series of events that would ultimately lead to that peaceful takeover of Mecca just 2 years later.
Okay, I have to hear more about this. How did the Muslims end up taking Mecca after being denied entry just 2 years earlier? It doesn't seem like something the Quraysh would just willingly allow.
You're right. It wasn't a simple handover. The circumstances that led to the conquest of Mecca were complex. It involved this series of political maneuvers and strategic alliances. Remember that treaty with the Quraysh? It hadn't just, established a temporary truce.
Right.
It had also created this web of alliances, obligations between various tribes. And when one of those allied tribes, they violated the terms of the treaty by attacking a tribe allied with the Muslims, it gave the Prophet Muhammad that justification he needed to march on Mecca.
So it wasn't just a military victory, but also a strategic one, using the terms of the treaty to their advantage.
Exactly. And it's a testament to the Prophet Muhammad's political acumen, his ability to navigate those complex tribal politics of Arabia. When he set out for Mecca with this force of 10,000 men, the Quraysh, they realized resistance was futile.
They surrendered the city without a fight.
Wow. What a moment that must have been, after years of struggle, persecution, exile, to finally return to Mecca in a position of power. Can you imagine what that must have felt like for the Prophet and his followers?
It's hard to even comprehend the emotions they must have, experienced.
Mm-hmm.
But what's even more remarkable is how the Prophet Muhammad handled this victory. Despite all the hardship, the persecution he and his followers had endured at the hands of the Quraysh, he chose to enter Mecca not as a conqueror, but as a liberator.
What do you mean by that?
Instead of, seeking revenge, he offered a general amnesty to all the inhabitants of Mecca. He forgave his former enemies, declaring that there would be, no reprisals.
Wow.
This act of magnanimity, it shocked many, and it sent this powerful message about the true nature of Islam.
It's incredible to think that he would choose forgiveness over vengeance after everything they had been through. It really speaks to those core values of Islam, doesn't it? It does. It highlights that importance of mercy, compassion, reconciliation in Islam. And this act, it set this crucial precedent for how Muslims would interact with
Mm-hmm.
those they conquered in the future, and it's established this model of integration coexistence rather than one of, subjugation and resentment.
Sounds like the conquest of Mecca was this turning point, not just in the political landscape of Arabia, but also in the development of Islamic thought and practice.
It was. It marked the beginning of a new era for the Muslims, an era of expansion, consolidation. And al-Waqi, through his vivid storytelling, brings this era to life for us. He describes the numerous expeditions and campaigns that followed the conquest of Mecca, painting this picture of the rapid spread of Islam across that Arabian Peninsula.
So after the conquest of Mecca, did things settle down for the Muslims?
Yeah.
Did they finally get a moment to, like, breathe?
Well, not quite. While the conquest of Mecca was this major victory, it didn't mean that all resistance to Islam just vanished. There were still, tribes and factions who opposed the Prophet Muhammad's message. And al-Waqidi, he describes these ongoing challenges in detail. He recounts battles, skirmishes, negotiations, strategic alliances, showing us that complex tapestry of events that shaped this period.
It sounds like even with Mecca under their control, the Muslims still faced a lot of opposition. What were some of the key challenges they had to overcome?
One of the biggest challenges was dealing with the Byzantine Empire,
Okay.
this powerful Christian force that controlled these vast territories to the north.
Right.
The Byzantines, they saw the rise of Islam as this threat to their own influence and interests in the region, and tensions were constantly, simmering along their borders.
So the threat now came not from within Arabia, but from a powerful external force.
Exactly. And al-Waqidi, he recounts the Battle of Mu'tah, which took place in present-day Jordan. It was one of the first major encounters between the Muslims and the Byzantines, and it highlights the challenges they faced in expanding their reach beyond that Arabian Peninsula.
What happened at Mu'tah? Was it a victory for the Muslims?
Mu'tah is an interesting case because while the Muslims they faced heavy losses, they were forced to withdraw. It's not seen as a defeat in Islamic tradition. The bravery and resilience they showed in the face of this much larger, better equipped Byzantine army, it cemented their reputation as a force to be reckoned with. It demonstrated that they were willing to fight and die for their beliefs.
Sounds like Mu'tah, even though it wasn't a clear victory, had a huge impact on the morale and image of the Muslims.
Absolutely. And it set the stage for future confrontations with the Byzantines. Remember, this is a time of major power shifts in the region. The old empires, they were weakening, and new forces were emerging. The Muslims, with their unwavering faith and their growing military strength, they were positioned to become, major players on the world stage.
It's amazing to think that what started as this small community in Medina had, within a decade, become this force capable of challenging empires.
And it's a testament to the power of belief, the importance of unity, and the strategic brilliance of leaders like the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
But it wasn't just about military strength. It was also about diplomacy, negotiation, and the ability to forge alliances. Al-Waqidi gives us these glimpses into how the Muslims they interacted with different tribes and rulers using a combination of persuasion, strategic partnerships, and when necessary, military force to expand their influence.
Sounds like they were playing this very complex game of chess.
Yeah.
Carefully considering each move and its potential consequences.
Exactly. And al-Waqidi's book, it allows us to be flies on the wall during this pivotal period.
Yeah.
Witnessing those day-to-day decisions, the struggles, the triumphs that shaped the course of early Islamic history. He even shares a story about Abu Abs-Bijabr,
Okay.
a man known for his piety, but who was struggling financially. Despite his poverty, he joins a military expedition to Khaybar, a Jewish settlement north of Medina.
So even those who weren't wealthy felt compelled to participate in these expeditions. What was the motivation?
It was a combination of factors. For some, it was this religious duty to spread that message of Islam.
Uh-huh.
For others, it was a chance to gain, spoils of war, improve their economic situation. And for many, it was a combination of both. In the case of Abu Abs, al-Waqidi recounts how he encountered the Prophet Muhammad on this night march and received a blessing.
A blessing. What kind of blessing?
Well, according to the story, after receiving the blessing, Abu Abs, he experienced this significant increase in his wealth. It's a reminder that these military campaigns, they weren't just about, political and territorial gains. They were also seen as opportunities for spiritual growth, divine favor.
It's interesting how al-Waqidi just weaves together the personal, the political, the spiritual in his narrative. It gives us this much richer, more nuanced understanding of these historical events.
He also doesn't, shy away from those difficult aspects of this period.
Okay.
For example, he recounts the expedition to Tabuk, which was prompted by rumors of a Byzantine invasion.
So that threat from the Byzantine Empire continued to loom large.
It did. And the expedition to Tabuk is interesting because it was a particularly challenging one for the Muslims. It took place during a time of drought and hardship, and many were hesitant to leave their homes and their families. Al-Waqidi, he describes the difficulties they faced on the journey, the grumbling among some,
Right.
and the unwavering commitment of others.
It's a reminder that even in a community, united by faith, there will always be those who question, who doubt, and who struggle.
That's human nature. And the Prophet Muhammad, being a wise leader, he understood this. He used this combination of encouragement, persuasion, and sometimes even gentle rebukes to maintain, morale and unity.
Leadership in such challenging times really requires a deft touch.
It does. And al-Waqidi, perhaps unintentionally, gives us this masterclass in leadership through his portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad. We see how he inspires, motivates,
Yeah.
mediates, and makes those difficult decisions, all while staying true to his core principles.
And all of this leads up to a truly pivotal moment in Islamic history,
Yeah.
the farewell pilgrimage.
The farewell pilgrimage. It was this culmination of the Prophet Muhammad's life's work, a final journey to Mecca with tens of thousands of his followers.
Yeah.
It's during this pilgrimage that he delivers his final sermon, a message of unity, equality, and adherence to those teachings of Islam.
I can only imagine that emotional weight of that moment,
Yeah.
knowing it would be his last address to his followers.
Yeah.
What were some of the key messages he emphasized in his farewell sermon?
He reiterated those core principles of Islam, the belief in one God, the importance of prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage.
Yeah.
He emphasized that equality of all Muslims, regardless of race or social status. He condemned usury and injustice, urging his followers to treat one another with kindness and respect.
It sounds like he was laying out a blueprint for a just and compassionate society, a society that upheld the rights of all its members.
Exactly. And he also addressed the issue of women, emphasizing their rights and their importance in society. He reminded his followers that women were to be treated with dignity and respect, a message that was revolutionary for its time.
It's remarkable to think that those messages delivered over 1,400 years ago still resonate so deeply with Muslims today.
It's a testament to their universality, their enduring relevance. Al-Waqidi, he even includes this touching story about a companion of the Prophet named Sa'd bin Ubadah. When the Prophet's camel went missing, Sa'd immediately offered his own camel as a replacement, demonstrating that deep love and respect he had for the Prophet.
Yeah, it's those personal anecdotes that make history come alive for me. They remind us that these weren't just abstract events, but real life experiences that shape the lives of individuals and communities.
And al-Waqidi excels at weaving together that grand narrative of early Islamic history with these intimate glimpses into the lives of those who lived through these tumultuous times.
So the farewell pilgrimage was a culmination of the Prophet Muhammad's mission. But what happened next?
Well, shortly after returning to Medina from the farewell pilgrimage, the Prophet Muhammad, he fell ill and passed away. It was a moment of profound grief and uncertainty for the Muslim community. They had lost their leader, their guide, their inspiration.
I can only imagine that sense of loss they must have felt.
Yeah.
What happened to the Muslim community after the Prophet's death? Did they fracture? Did they fall apart?
They faced immense challenges, but But they didn't fall apart. In fact, they rose to the occasion, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability that had become, hallmarks of their community.
It's almost like the Prophet Muhammad had prepared them for this moment
Yeah.
by emphasizing unity, compassion, and adherence to those core principles of Islam. He had equipped them to navigate the challenges that lay ahead.
That's a great point. And it's in this period after the Prophet's death that we really see the fruits of his leadership. We'll delve into this transition and explore the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad in part 3 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We followed the story from those early days in Mecca to the expansion from Medina, and now we're at this critical point, the death of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah, it's a time of immense challenge for the Muslim community.
Right.
They lost their leader, their guide,
Yeah.
the very heart of their movement.
Yeah.
But it's also a time that shows, their strength, their incredible resilience.
You're right. It'd be easy to imagine the community falling apart after a loss like that. But the Muslims didn't. They adapted, they organized, they kept building on the foundation the Prophet laid.
Right.
I'm really interested in how they managed this transition. What happened right after the Prophet's death?
One of the most urgent things was, leadership. Who would guide the community now? There was no clear system for succession back then.
So how did they choose a new leader? Was there an election or like a power struggle?
It wasn't that simple. After a lot of discussion and deliberation, they chose Abu Bakr,
Okay.
a close companion and loyal friend to the Prophet.
Right.
He became the first caliph, the successor, the deputy. Abu Bakr was known for his piety, wisdom, and really unwavering commitment to the Prophet's teachings.
It seems like a wise choice, someone who could bring stability
Exactly.
during such an uncertain time.
Ugh.
What were some of the immediate challenges Abu Bakr faced?
He had a lot on his plate, both internal and external challenges.
Okay.
Some tribes saw the Prophet's death as a chance to, break away. They rebelled against Medina's authority. These uprisings, the Ridda Wars, they really threatened that unity the Prophet had worked so hard to create.
So Abu Bakr had to fight to hold the community together. That's a pretty daunting task. How did he do it?
He used a combination of, firmness and diplomacy. He sent out skilled commanders to put down those rebellions, but he also offered amnesty to those who'd come back. His aim wasn't to punish, but to reunite the community.
Yeah, it seems like he knew preserving that unity was crucial, especially at such a fragile time.
Right.
What other challenges did he face?
Well, besides the internal stuff, there were external threats, too.
Yeah.
The Byzantine and Persian empires.
Right, those regional superpowers.
Exactly. They were still wary of the Muslims' growing power.
So even with all those internal conflicts, the Muslims still had to deal with these powerful neighbors. How did they manage that?
It was, a delicate balance.
Yeah.
Abu Bakr had to solidify their hold within Arabia while also, defending their borders.
Right.
He oversaw the start of what would be this amazing period of expansion. Muslim armies pushing into Byzantine and Persian territory.
I'm noticing a theme here. Even when faced with huge challenges, the Muslims found a way not just to survive, but to actually thrive.
It really shows their resilience, their ability to adapt, and that unwavering belief in their mission.
Yeah.
They saw challenges not as setbacks, but like opportunities, opportunities to test their strength and spread the message of Islam. It was a powerful mix of faith and ambition.
Who were the leaders that came after Abu Bakr? Did they continue this path of expansion and solidifying their power?
Abu Bakr's time as caliph was pretty short, about 2 years.
Okay.
After his death, Umar ibn al-Khattab, another one of the Prophet's close companions,
Right.
became the caliph. Umar's reign, it marks this period of incredible expansion.
Okay.
He led conquests in Persia, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, transforming that once small community into a major world power.
Wow. That's amazing growth. What was the key to their success? Just military strength, or was it something more?
It was a few things coming together.
Okay.
The Muslim armies were very disciplined and motivated. They had some brilliant commanders. But it wasn't just brute force. Their message resonated with a lot of people in the regions they conquered.
What do you mean?
Well, back then, both the Byzantines and Persians, they were seen as oppressive by a lot of their own people. People were burdened by heavy taxes, often felt like second-class citizens. The Muslims offered a different system, one focused on justice, fairness, a shared faith.
So they were seen as like liberators in some cases.
Yeah, in many cases, yes. They offered a welcome change from the old ways, and lots of people converted to Islam, seeing it as a chance for social mobility and, spiritual fulfillment.
That's fascinating. How military power and a powerful message can lead to such rapid change.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember this wasn't just about conquest, it was also about building a new civilization. The early caliphs, they worked on creating institutions, legal systems, promoting scholarship and learning.
They weren't just focused on territory, they were building a legacy.
Exactly. They understood real power isn't just about military might, it's about creating a just and prosperous society, a society that values knowledge.
We've covered a lot in our deep dive, from the beginnings of a new faith to the challenges after the Prophet's death and the rise of the Muslim empire. As we wrap up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away?
I think the most important takeaway is just how much change and transformation happened in this period.
Mhm.
It's a story about faith, courage, resilience, and ambition. It's about how a small group, united by their beliefs, overcame so much to build a civilization that changed the world.
And it's a story that's still relevant today,
Definitely.
reminding us of the power of belief, the importance of community, and the lasting legacy of the Prophet Muhammad.
It really does. And it challenges us to look beyond those simple narratives and really engage with the complexities of this fascinating period in history, a period that's often misunderstood.
And to our listeners, we leave you with this. How can understanding the early history of Islam, with all its nuances, inform your perspective on the world today? How can these stories of faith, resilience, and ambition inspire you?